What the hell happens when we die? I chose that name for this series because not only do I really love a good pun, but also because that is our basic reaction to death. What the hell? It often feels senseless. We want to protest. We have more questions than answers, and that often makes us feel really uncomfortable. And I'm not speaking from the safe remove of, say, academic inquiry. I experienced these things deep down this March when my mom died, and in 2010 after the earthquake in Haiti. The following year, in 2011, I spent a lot of time pondering death, experiencing death, and ministering to the bereaved. As Episcopal clergy, we're required to do 400 hours of something called clinical pastoral education, and I did mine in an intensive care and trauma facility in Boston. And one of the things that I noticed there was how difficult it was for some people to face the imminence of their own death. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but it was really hard for some people to die. They carried deep regrets, unresolved tensions in family relationships, words left unsaid to friends and to lovers. Many wished they had spent more time tending to their relationships and a lot less time tending to their careers. And we've probably all heard about these regrets before. But the biggest fear, and this actually surprised me as someone who loves to nerd out on theology, the biggest fear that most people faced by far stemmed from the fact that many of them began experiencing phenomena outside their rational worldview, and they just didn't know what to do about it. They had no framework to begin to even process it. They were completely adrift in the experience. Being suddenly confronted with the possibility that there's something more was terrifying for some and really comforting for others. Either way, though, they had questions. They had so many questions, and big questions about the meaning of life, about spiritual, religious, and theological things, and they didn't have time to work it out. And this resulted in a level of existential anxiety that's honestly difficult to describe unless you're in the face of it in the moment. For some, it manifested as just sheer panic. For others, it was a little bit more low burning, but very present. And that was some of the hardest, but also the holiest work I've ever done. Being able to sit with people on their deathbeds, not just to pray with them, but to help them actively work out what it is they really believed as they were transitioning to this next reality. And that's a lot of what's driving this series. I want us to talk about all the things. I want us to talk about heaven and hell, purgatory, angels, God, demons, devil, all of it. I want us to get it out there, to actually name it, and not to be afraid. Because we deserve to have those conversations now rather than later. And of course, our views may shift and change over time. I hope that they do. They probably will. It's usually the mark of some kind of spiritual maturity. But my hope is that this series will provide a very useful framework to enter those questions without fear of the unknown, which is not to say that the unknown will ever cease to be the unknown. Anyone who talks about death and dying with absolute certainty isn't being honest, and actually, our scriptures say that point blank. One of my favorite quotes in this regard is Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians, that beautiful excursus on love. Love is patient, love is kind. And do you remember how he ends that excursus? He says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, but then I will know fully, even as I am fully known." This is coming from the Apostle Paul. That's a pretty big deal. It's certainly cause, I think, for us to be humble before this subject. I mentioned earlier that many hospital patients I visited as a summer chaplain experienced these phenomena outside their rational worldview. And I want to just share a little bit about what that looked like. It typically fell into these three different categories. And the first were deathbed visions. And it might happen a couple of days before people died, but maybe someone would come to them, a deceased family member or a religious figure. Sometimes they would just be present, they would stand there. They could see them, but others couldn't. Another time, they were very active. They had a message and they engaged in conversation. But it was very, very real to them. The other two are probably much more familiar to you. That is near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And I want to actually talk about this because as important as the theological dimensions are that we're talking about, there's also just the reality of what it's like to die. So often near-death experiences, or NDEs, and out-of-body experiences, or OBEs, are actually connected. In a recent study from 2017 published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, a third of all respondents reported that their NDEs began with an OBE and ended with the experience of their bodies returning, of their spirits returning to their body. So the two are connected. So this is also really fascinating. Only about 3 to 10% of those near-death experiences were in any way fearful. The vast majority of the time, NDEs are positive, overwhelmingly positive. So they have also a surprisingly common set of traits across experiences. And the traits kind of vary a little bit according to culture and tradition. But within cultures and traditions, they're remarkably consistent. And they're so consistent, they've kind of become cliches for us culturally, right? The light at the end of the tunnel, we say that. But actually, it's a thing. So this is typically what an NDE might entail. Feelings of peace and painlessness, which is really important because they often occur in a space of intensely physical pain, right? A sudden immersion in light, moving down a dark tunnel toward the light, a feeling of non-duality, of suddenly merging with or becoming one with all things. Often of being greeted by deceased loved ones or spiritual beings, moving through a beautiful landscape like nothing they'd ever seen before. Occasionally there's a life review, right, like a screen and the whole life thing. But more often, there's a conversation at the end of this whole process. And the conversation involves a negotiation or a communication from the person that is guiding them. And it has to do with whether or not they're ready to fully enter this new reality or whether they have to return. And often returning is really hard. It's really hard because once they've experienced this, they don't want to go back. But sometimes it's the reverse. Sometimes they become so aware of having to leave it all behind, like all of it, right? Think about the people that you love the absolute most, all those unresolved things, careers, titles, all of it, that becomes really terrifying for them and they want to go back. So very different kinds of reactions at this stage. But when they do return, the vast majority of these subjects often experience a very heightened sense of compassion for others, less focus on themselves, on accumulating wealth, less fear of death, which is pretty remarkable, and a much greater concern for the well-being of all things, not just humans, but things like plants, animals, the planet. And as you can imagine, these experiences, they continue to vex the scientific community. So many have actually attempted to propose explanations, usually that have to do with either the excess or the deficit of certain neurochemicals, which may prompt hallucinations, for example. And others have proposed that they may be triggered by a neurological confusion between the dream state and the waking state, producing this third and kind of unique consciousness, which we just haven't classified yet, a kind of third consciousness between dreaming and waking. And then others like Michael Pollan, you know Michael Pollan, he's like super into microdosing. So Michael Pollan has argued that they're possible whenever it's called the default mode network. That's the part of our brains that creates that impression of ego. So he says whenever that part of our brain begins to fall away, and you can do it in any number of ways. You can do it while you're fasting, through prayer, through meditation. but that this actively begins to happen in the end-of-life process. And that as that part of our brain falls away, a more primitive part of our brain begins to take over. And that's the part of our brain that formed when we were very young and that we functioned off of when we were just children. You know, when babies and children have a much stronger sense of being connected to things, they actually need to learn to separate themselves out from other things, so that sense of non-differentiation, and a very active imagination. So you can kind of see where he's coming from with this, right? Now, the problem, though, with all these physical explanations is that none of them actually explains all the features of the NDEs or the OBEs, and most scientists who are completely honest will actually admit that. And particularly perplexing are these rare cases when patients can recall in considerable detail medical conversations happening around them after they've flatlined. So, in other words, it's during a time when it should be neurologically impossible for them to register sound and memory in this way. They shouldn't be able to hear it and they shouldn't be able to recall it, but somehow they do. And then even spookier are the out-of-body experiences in the very rare instances where patients can sometimes document what objects are in a room, or sometimes even rooms beyond their room. Again, in enough detail to be quite convincing, with the full knowledge that there was no way that they had the kind of sight lines or vantage point to see the things that they were describing, right? So this creates a real problem if you believe that consciousness is linked only to the brain, right? So that is basically the debate. It's a scientific debate, it's philosophical, it's religious, but the really big question is, what is that relationship between the mind or the soul and the brain? And that becomes one of the most important features of this whole conversation around end-of-life experience. So if it were just localized in the brain, people ask, how could it possibly be that you could have something like an out-of-body experience? And one of the answers that people have comes from William James. Do you remember him? William James was a big philosopher in the 19th century, and he talked about the fact that consciousness, not the fact, but his understanding that consciousness is actually everywhere, and that our brains don't produce it, they actually mediate it. But so it doesn't have an origin in the brain necessarily, but the brain does play a critical function in how it works in us. So it's kind of a middle road. But obviously this debate has pretty huge implications for the Christian doctrine of the human soul and for life after death. But I think we should also be very careful here. Not only because this debate is far from resolved, but also because our contemporary understanding of what happens when we die, from a Christian point of view, is not necessarily biblical. It's not necessarily consistent with what other Christians have understood in centuries past, and especially not what the writers of Scripture imagined. It's also really important, I think, for us to ask, with these end-of-life experiences, is that it? Is that the end? Because many people who have them believe that is the end, that is the fruition, and there's nothing more. But again, that's going to become a real turning point when we think about our tradition, what's going on, and how we might think about this a little bit more. So before we can have those conversations over the next 4 weeks, we need to have some really basic understanding of the biblical worldview. And first and foremost, we might actually notice that from today's reading, there isn't really a single biblical worldview regarding death, and that is a problem. Sometimes when people ask about what happens when we die, I think that they expect me to point to something like a Book of the Dead. Do you know the Egyptian Book of the Dead? Right? It's these elaborate papyruses that explain exactly how the soul traverses through different areas of the underworld. And it gives people spells, incantations to say at the gateways of each of these different places. And the ultimate goal is to lead them to the place of Aru. It's this field, open field. It's kind of the Egyptian version of heaven. But we just don't have that in the Bible. The testimonies are much more varied and scattered. So I chose that reading from Ecclesiastes because it represents what most scholars consider to be probably one of the most ancient accounts of death theology from early Israel. And we notice in Ecclesiastes that the author laments how it doesn't much matter how we live because we're all going to die. And I think this view tends to shock us. It doesn't seem to suppose any larger sense of divine justice, putting to right the things that have gone wrong. There is no last judgment. It doesn't imply any future beyond the grave, no resurrection, no afterlife, no nothing. For the author of Ecclesiastes, this life is where it is at. He says a living dog is better than a dead lion. In other words, you can be the smallest nobody, but if you're not 6 feet under, you're still greater than the greatest of heroes, of holy men, and of kings who have died. That's kind of a remarkable statement. Just because you're above ground, you're greater than Abraham. Okay. And did you notice that everyone's going to the same exact place? There's no heaven, there's no hell, just this place called Sheol, where, quote, there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom. Sounds kind of boring. And he seems to suggest that because our lives are capricious and death may come at any time, that we should enjoy what we have while it lasts. Go eat your bread with enjoyment and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved of, and another way to think of that in Hebrew is determined what you do. When it says earlier that the works of the righteous and the unrighteous are in God's hands, it doesn't mean that God is judging them. It means that God has foreordained them. It means that there's a certain sense of a foregone conclusion. And this sort of Epicurean seize-the-day theology did not go over terribly well with later editors of the text. How many of you remember from a couple weeks ago when we talked about manuscript variations in the textual tradition of the Bible? Remember that? And remember how sometimes when a scribe didn't like what they read, they might insert their 2 cents there. So that has happened quite a bit with Ecclesiastes. And particularly in those passages where Ecclesiastes, where we see mentions of fearing God, of honoring the law, the entire ending of the book, those are probably all added later by editors who just couldn't cope with the idea that this book essentially could have been written by an atheist, right? If you take out all those references. That's a really, really far cry from what we read in Matthew, isn't it? I mean, it's almost as far away from Matthew as you can get theologically. In fact, atheism would actually be maybe a little bit cleaner, wouldn't it? In many ways, Matthew and Ecclesiastes are on opposite ends of this spectrum. Jesus tells this elaborate story about some bridesmaids who are camping outside a banquet hall. Half have enough oil, and the other half don't, and it sucks to be the other half. They all fall asleep, but when the bridegroom returns unexpectedly, we get 2 very different endings. Those without enough oil are locked out of the banquet to remain in the darkness of night. And the punchline is, keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. My grandma used to say that to us when we were kids. You know not the day nor the hour. And it sounded kind of spooky, but I always remembered it. In this parable, sleep represents death. That's pretty obvious. And throughout the scriptures, about more than 50 times actually in scripture, various books talk about death in that way. They talk about death as a kind of sleep, which is where that tradition comes from in our culture. So everyone falls asleep. But there's also this thing that happens. There's a shout. There's a shout and they're woken up. And the shout is associated with, does anyone know? And in the twinkling of an eye, a trump shall sound, the dead shall be raised. Did any of you grow up evangelical? Yeah? Did you remember the rapture theology? So, right, what do you get? You get a shout, maybe a horn. You get a really loud noise that follows the resurrection, right? But then we have this resurrection, And it's interesting. Everyone is raised, but not everyone gets the same outcome. Those with enough oil, they get to party. The kingdom of heaven is like this. Some are in and some are out. The others are stuck out in the cold. They're stuck out in the cold beyond the walls of the banqueting hall, outside where it's a little bit dangerous and it's night. It's not where you want to be. So how exactly did we get from Ecclesiastes' kind of meh, enjoy it while it lasts, to Jesus' you better watch out vigilance? How did that happen? How did that happen? Over the next 4 weeks, I hope to take us on a journey together. We'll ask questions like, what happens to the soul when we die? Is there such a thing as an afterlife in Christianity? Are afterlife, heaven, and eternity the same thing? That's a really interesting question, actually. And is there any difference between paradise and heaven? How do you get from Sheol, that abode of the dead, to the lake of fire, right? What happens if we take sins to the grave? We often hear people say this, right? I'm taking this to the grave. What happens if we actually do that? What happens if we're prevented from fully entering the presence of God at our death? And a big one, does the Bible really teach that hell exists and that most people are destined for it, as I think many of us probably learned in those evangelical and perhaps sometimes in Catholic backgrounds? These are some really big questions, and I don't suppose to answer them for us, but I do hope, again, over the next 4 weeks to explore them with enough audacity and framework to help you begin to answer those questions for yourself. I want everyone here to have the advantage over those people I witnessed in hospice on those deathbeds. So to begin that conversation, I want us to break up into small groups. There are some questions that are going to be going up right over here. There are 3 different kinds of questions. These are 3 suggested questions. And because we're Christian, 3 is always great. I would suggest gathering in groups of 3. We're going to have 10 minutes, so 3 minutes each. And think about that as you're sharing with each other. You might talk about this. What do you believe happens when you die? What do you want to learn or take away from this series? That's something I'm interested in. And do you know anyone who's had a near-death experience? Have you had a near-death experience? Does your family have a history of stories of near-death experiences? Some families do. What are those? What is that like? After we're finished talking, we'll come back together. We'll talk a little bit about what we've heard from each other, and then we'll go into the Eucharist. So just take a few minutes, 10 minutes, groups of 3, and go to it.